Clara Whitmore used both fists to pound against the locked wooden door, until her knuckles split open and bled, until her voice gave out, and the screaming turned to silence. Until she slid down to the dirt floor and stopped believing anyone was coming. She had been locked inside this rotting storage cabin for 3 days. No water, no food, no one who cared. Her uncle had done this to her. Her own blood, and every single person in that town had let him. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, because this story is just beginning. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The door didn't give on the first kick. Elias Crow wasn't the kind of man who kicked doors down as a habit. He was 40 years old, broad across the shoulders, weathered down to the bone by 15 years of mountain living, and he had learned a long time ago that most things that looked locked from the outside were best left that way. A man who went poking into other people's trouble usually ended up buried in it. He knew that from experience. He had the scars to prove it. But he had heard something, not a scream. Screams he could have talked himself out of. Screams carried on the wind and faded fast, and a man could convince himself he imagined them if he needed to badly enough. What Elias heard was worse than a scream. It was the sound of fists hitting wood. Slow, deliberate, like someone who had already screamed themselves dry and was now just trying to remind the world they were still there. He stood outside the old storage cabin on the dead end of the mining road, about 2 miles east of Harlan Creek, and he listened to that sound for a long moment. His horse, Ranger, shifted beneath him and blew a hard breath through his nose. "I know," Elias said quietly. He dismounted. The cabin was a sorry thing. It had been abandoned since the Creighton Mining Company pulled out of the valley 4 years back, and nobody had touched it since. The roof had started to sag on the western side. The wood was gray and splitting. There was a rusted iron padlock on the door hasps, not the kind that came with the original building. The kind somebody had brought out here and put on recently. On purpose, Elias stared at that padlock for 3 full minutes. Then he went back to Ranger's saddlebag and came back with a short iron pry bar. It took 2 tries. The lock broke on the second, and the hasp tore away from the rotted doorframe, and the door swung inward hard, and the smell hit him first: close air, unwashed skin, old wood, and something metallic he recognized immediately and didn't want to think about too hard. Then he saw her. She was on the floor in the far corner, her back pressed into the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. She had a large frame, broad-shouldered, heavy and full in the body, the kind of woman who took up space unapologetically, even when she was clearly trying to make herself as small as possible. Her dress was a faded brown prairie dress that had once been decent quality and was now torn at the left sleeve and stained dark at the hem. Her hair was chestnut brown and had come mostly loose from whatever braid it had started in, falling around her face in tangled pieces. Her hands, folded over her knees, had dried blood on the knuckles. She looked up at him. Her eyes were brown and exhausted, and she did not flinch when she saw him. She just looked, like she was trying to figure out whether what she was seeing was real, or whether her mind had finally started playing tricks on her. "Ma'am," Elias said. He kept his voice even. He stayed in the doorway because he knew better than to crowd a frightened person in a small space. "You real?" she asked. Her voice came out rough, cracked down the middle from disuse. "Far as I know," he said. She stared at him another moment. Then she said, "How long? How long what? How long was I in here?" Elias looked at the light through the door, calculated, and said, "Best I can figure. It's the afternoon of the 23rd. Wednesday." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her face. Not relief exactly. More like a woman doing arithmetic in her head and not liking the answer she came up with. 3 days, she said. "Yes, ma'am. They left me in here for 3 days. He didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to say to it that didn't require him to know things he didn't know yet. He just took the canteen from where it hung at his hip, uncapped it, and held it out toward her. She looked at his hand for a second, just his hand. Then she reached out and took the canteen. She drank slowly and carefully, the way a person did when they'd been without water, long enough to know better than to gulp. When she lowered it, she wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist and handed it back. "Thank you," she said. "Can you stand?" "I can stand." "You don't have to prove anything to me, ma'am. If you need help." I said I can stand. She planted one hand against the wall behind her and pushed herself upright, and she did it without any help from him, though he watched her carefully in case she needed it. She was taller than he had expected, and steadier. Her legs were shaking slightly, he could see it, but she didn't buckle. She pressed one hand against the wall until the shaking stopped, and then she let go. She walked toward the door on her own. When she stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, she stopped and closed her eyes and turned her face up toward the sky for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He let her have that. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him with the kind of directness that surprised him. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "I own land up the creek valley, east of Harlan. My uncle Nathaniel Voss had me put in there. He wants me to sign over my property, and he figured if he locked me up long enough, I'd agree to anything." She paused. "I want you to understand that before you decide whether you're going to help me or not." Elias looked at her for a moment. She had blood on her knuckles and mud on her dress, and she'd been locked in a storage cabin without water for 3 days, and she was standing in front of him giving him facts like she was presenting a business case. Like she was giving him the information and letting him make his choice without putting any pressure on him. Without begging. He respected that more than he could have explained. "My name's Elias Crow," he said. "I've got a camp about 3 miles north." "Can you ride?" "All right then." He turned toward Ranger. "Let's get you somewhere safe first. Everything else comes after." She didn't argue. She didn't thank him again either, which he also appreciated. She just walked over to the horse and let him give her a hand up into the saddle, and he took the lead rope and started walking north along the mountain trail, and neither of them spoke for a while. That was the beginning of it. Elias Crow had not always been a man who lived alone in the mountains. There had been a time once when he had been something else entirely. A soldier first, then a lawman, then a husband and a man who believed the world could be made better through effort and intention. The world had disagreed with him on that last point rather thoroughly. He'd lost his wife, Margaret, in the winter of 1876. Fever, the kind that took a person in 10 days and didn't give you any warning until it was already too late. He'd buried her on the eastern slope of a ridge in Wyoming, in frozen ground, and he'd spent the better part of the following year doing things he wasn't proud of, drinking mostly, and picking fights, and generally making himself as destructive as possible. Then he'd come north, into the Bitterroot Mountains. And he'd built the cabin with his own hands, and he'd decided that the world could do whatever it liked as long as it did it without him. He'd been mostly at peace with that arrangement for 8 years. Clara Whitmore complicated it. By the time they reached the camp, the afternoon light was going golden and long across the slope. He helped her down from the saddle and led her inside, and he built the fire up and put on coffee and set out what food he had: dried venison, hard biscuits, some dried apple that was chewy but edible, and she ate steadily and without comment. The way a person ate when they were too hungry to pretend they weren't. When she was done, she set her hands flat on the table and looked across at him. "You're wondering how I ended up in there," she said. "I'm wondering a lot of things," he said. "You don't have to tell me any of them." "I want to." She straightened slightly. "I want to, because if you're going to help me, you need to know what you're walking into." He poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her and said, "All right." Clara Whitmore, he learned, was 27 years old and had spent nearly all of those years in the shadow of other people's opinions. She had grown up on the land her father, William Whitmore, had homesteaded in 1863, 20 acres of Creek Valley land that was nothing special to look at, but was productive and well-watered and worth having. She had helped her father work it since she was old enough to hold a tool. She knew every inch of it. Her mother had died when Clara was 14, and after that it was just the 2 of them, her and her father, and they had managed. Not easily, but honestly, and when her father died of a stroke 2 years ago, he had left everything to Clara in a will that was clear and properly witnessed and filed with the county clerk. That should have been the end of it. The land was hers. It was simple, except that Nathaniel Voss had decided it wasn't going to be simple. Nathaniel was her mother's brother. He owned the largest spread in the valley and had been expanding for years, buying up small properties when their owners ran into trouble, pressuring others until they gave up and sold. He was good at it. He had the money and the patience and the willingness to be unpleasant, and that combination tended to work. When William Whitmore died, Nathaniel had shown up at Clara's door inside of a week. He was very polite about it at first, Clara said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He told me that a woman on her own couldn't manage a working farm. That it wasn't right, that I needed to think about my future. He offered me money, said I could go to the city, start fresh somewhere new. She paused. I told him the land wasn't for sale. How'd that go over? About as well as you'd expect, a short, humorless sound. After that, things started happening. Small things at first. My fence line cut in the night, so my cattle drifted. Tools gone missing, then bigger things. He started talking. Around town to anyone who'd listen, saying I was out of my depth. Saying a woman my size, living alone, making decisions on her own, saying I was an embarrassment to my father's memory. That I was going to run the property into the ground. Her jaw tightened for a moment, and then she made herself relax it. People listen, she said. That's the part She stopped. Tried again. I've lived in that town my whole life. My father was a respected man, but Nathaniel has money, and I have a large body, and in their minds, that settled the argument before it ever started. A woman who looks the way I look doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. She gets the verdict, and then she gets the sentence. Elias didn't say anything. He let her talk. 6 weeks ago, he came to the property with 2 of his men. He had papers. Said they proved the original deed had an error, that my father had actually signed over partial rights to him years back in exchange for a loan. She shook her head. It was a lie. My father never borrowed money from Nathaniel. They barely tolerated each other, but the papers looked official, and his men backed his story, and the town wanted to believe him because it was easier than believing me. Why didn't you go to the sheriff? She looked at him. He understood without her having to say it. He'd been around long enough to know what a county sheriff looked like when he was in someone's pocket. There are real documents, Clara said. My father kept everything. The original deed, correspondence, everything. He kept it all in a locked tin box in the farmhouse, buried under the floorboards in the back bedroom. I know exactly where it is. Those documents would prove Nathaniel's papers are forgeries. And the farmhouse is currently occupied by Nathaniel's men. He moved them in 3 weeks ago, said the property was legally in dispute and he had the right to protect his claim. Her voice stayed level, but he could hear what it cost her. And then, when I tried to get into town and find a lawyer, he had me picked up on the road. His men. They told me I was causing trouble, that I needed to calm down and reconsider, and they took me out to that cabin. She met his eyes. And they locked the door. The fire crackled between them. Elias turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. He was a man who had spent 8 years teaching himself not to care about other people's problems, and he was sitting across from a woman who had just laid out a very large problem in very precise detail. And he was already calculating distances in his head without quite deciding to. Why didn't they just? He stopped himself. He knew why. Making someone disappear created questions. Making someone sign a legal document created a clean ending. He needs me alive to sign, Clara said quietly. Once I sign, I'm of no use to him. The implication sat in the air between them, without either of them having to name it. These men of his, Elias said. How many at the farmhouse? I saw 3 when they moved in. He has others in town, people he pays or people he has something over. The sheriff is one of them, I believe. The judge. Circuit judge comes through 3 times a year. Next visit is in 8 weeks. So you can't go to law, not local law, no, and the nearest federal marshal's office. Missoula. Elias nodded slowly. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, I hear you. That's what I mean. He stood up and moved to put more wood on the fire. You need to sleep tonight. Your hands need tending. In the morning, we talk about next steps. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Crow, I want to be direct with you. You've been pretty direct already, ma'am. I don't expect you to stop now. I don't know you. I don't know why you opened that door or what you expect in return, and I need to tell you clearly I don't have money to offer. The land itself I won't sign away to anyone, including someone who helps me. I won't trade one form of obligation for another. He turned and looked at her. She was watching him steadily, and there was no apology in it. Just the statement, here are my terms, here is who I am. Decide accordingly. He felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Something that might have been admiration. Miss Whitmore, he said, I don't want your land. I opened that door because somebody was inside, and people don't belong locked in boxes. That's the beginning and end of my reasoning. He paused. I'd appreciate if you didn't read anything else into it. She studied him another moment. Then she gave a small nod. Not agreement, exactly. More like a decision being registered. Then I thank you, she said, for now. We'll see what happens tomorrow. He let her have the bed, and he slept on the floor near the fire, which was an arrangement he'd used before, and didn't mind. He slept lightly, the way mountain living taught a man to sleep. He heard her shift twice in the night, and once he heard a sound that might have been quiet weeping, and might have been nothing, and he kept his eyes closed and pretended he had not heard it. Because there were some things a person needed to do in private, and dignity was a thin enough thing when you'd been through what she'd been through. He wasn't going to take any more of it. In the morning she was up before him, which surprised him. She had found the water barrel and the washing cloth and done the best she could with both, and she was sitting at the table with her hands folded and her braid reteed neatly when he opened his eyes. You found everything, he said. I didn't touch your things. Just the water. I don't mind. He made breakfast pan bread and the last of his eggs, which he'd been saving, and more coffee, and they ate. And then he brought out the rough hand-drawn map he kept of the valley and the surrounding territory, and he laid it on the table between them. Show me where the farmhouse is, he said. She leaned forward and put her finger on the map without hesitation. He looked at the position. He knew the road. He'd ridden past that property before, without paying it much attention, just another small homestead in the creek valley. 2 miles south of Harlan Creek proper, which was the nearest thing to a town in this part of the mountains. Harlan Creek had a general store, a saloon, a post office that also served as a land office on Tuesdays, a small church that served as a courthouse on the third Friday of every month, and approximately 240 people. A number Elias had ascertained once and never thought much about again. The tin box, he said, under the floorboards. Which board? The third board from the north wall. There's a knot on the right side of it. If you press the knot and lift, it comes up. She'd told him that, without hesitating, which meant she trusted him with it. He didn't take that lightly. I know a man named Roy Cassell, Elias said slowly. Used to be a territorial surveyor. He's been living rough north of the ridge for the last couple years, but he's honest and he knows land documents he'd know a forgery. If we can get into that house and get the tin box, Roy can tell us what we're looking at. And then what? Then we go to Missoula. Or we find a way to hold Nathaniel Voss accountable that doesn't require us to wait 8 weeks for a circuit judge. Clara looked at the map. They'll have someone watching the road. Probably. And the house is occupied, yes, and my uncle is a powerful man in this valley who has been planning this for months and has everything set up exactly the way he wants it. That's my understanding of the situation, yes. She looked up at him. There was something sharp and clear in her expression. So what you're saying is, we don't have very good odds. I've seen worse. That's not comforting. Wasn't trying to comfort you. You asked for honesty. He looked at the map again. The fact that he's got everything set up is also a weakness. He's not expecting resistance. He had you locked in a box, and he thinks you're still in it. He hasn't had to account for a complication. You're the complication. We both are. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I want to be part of it. Whatever you plan. I don't want to be set somewhere safe while you manage things for me. This is my land, my father's land. I have the right to fight for it myself. Elias had spent 8 years living alone. He was accustomed to making his own decisions without consulting anyone. His immediate instinct was to argue it would be safer, cleaner, easier if she stayed at the cabin. He could move faster alone. He knew this territory better than any of Nathaniel's hired men. He looked at her hands, at the dried blood on her knuckles from 3 days of pounding on a locked door. He thought about the way she had walked out of that cabin under her own power. The way she had given him her terms before he'd even offered help. All right, he said. She blinked. Just like that? Is there something else you expected? I expected an argument. Well, he folded the map. Maybe I'm contrary today. He looked at her briefly. You know this land. You know these people. That makes you useful. I don't bring useless people into situations like this. Something moved across her face. Something complicated and quick that she controlled before it could fully form. He got the impression it had been a long time since someone had called her useful without meaning it as an insult. She didn't say anything else about it. When do we move? She asked. Tonight after dark. We go for the farmhouse first. The hours before dark were long. Elias went about his usual tasks, checking his supplies, tending to Ranger, sharpening the tools he might need, and Clara moved around the cabin quietly, not getting in his way, but not disappearing either. At one point, he glanced over and found her crouched the small herb shelf where he kept basic medicinals, the things he'd accumulated over years of living in a territory where the nearest doctor was a long ride away. She was examining each one carefully. You know plants, he said. She looked up. My father taught me some. The rest I taught myself. Loneliness is useful for that. You learn what's around you. What's that one? He nodded at the one she was holding. Yarrow, she said. Good for wounds, helps stop bleeding. You've got it dried right too. Some people over-dry it and lose the property. My wife used to. He stopped. Clara looked at him but didn't push. She knew plants, he said after a moment. She was better at it than I was. You were married. She's gone 8 years ago. Clara set the yarrow back in its place carefully. I'm sorry, she said. And it didn't sound like something she said, because she was supposed to. It sounded like she meant it. He nodded once and went back to what he was doing. Later, when the light had gotten low and they were eating a simple supper before starting out, he found himself noticing things about her that he hadn't expected to notice. The way she listened completely, without fidgeting, without waiting for her turn to speak. The way she asked questions that went straight to the point without circling around. The way she didn't apologize for taking up space at his table, in his cabin, in this situation, which was more than he could say for most people he'd encountered. She had a quality he didn't have a precise word for. A kind of settled certainty about herself that wasn't arrogance. He'd seen arrogance, and it looked nothing like this. This was more like a person who had been told so many times that she was wrong that she'd eventually had to decide for herself what was right, and once she made that decision, she had stuck to it. There was a quietness in it, and a strength. He thought about that locked door. About the fist marks he had seen on the inside of the wood. 3 days. She had kept fighting for 3 days. He had known grown men, hard men, soldiers with years of experience, who would have stopped trying long before that. Miss Whitmore, he said. She looked up, for what it's worth. What you did in there, keeping on like that. He held her gaze. That took grit. She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her hands at the knuckles that were scabbing over now, and then she looked back up at him. I kept thinking about the box under the floor, she said. My father's handwriting on those documents. Everything he worked for. That's what I kept thinking about. She paused. It gave me something to hit for. He understood that, better than most people would have. When full dark had settled over the mountains and the stars were bright and sharp, they left the cabin. He saddled Ranger and helped her up, and he walked beside the horse, moving by memory through the dark trails he knew, as well as the lines on his own hands. They went south and east, down off the ridge and into the valley, moving quietly through the pine-heavy dark. 2 miles out from the farmhouse, he stopped. "Wait here," he said quietly. "Not because I don't trust you, because I need to see what we're walking into before we both walk into it. 10 minutes. If I'm not back in 20, ride north to the cabin and stay there. And if you don't come back at all, then ride to Missoula. Go to the federal marshal's office. Tell them what you told me. Write it all down first." She looked at him for a moment in the starlight. "All right," she said. 10 minutes. He moved through the dark with the ease of long practice, approaching the farmhouse from the north along the tree line, keeping low and slow. He could see a light through one window, a lamp burning, and the silhouettes of 2 men on the porch. The horses in the small paddock by the barn told him there were at least 3 people here, maybe 4. He watched for a while, counted the movements, mapped the patterns. Then he went back. 2 on the porch, he said when he reached her. "At least 1 inside. There's a root cellar on the east side. I saw the door. If we can draw the 2 on the porch around to the west side, that gives me a window on the east. Maybe 3 minutes to get inside, get to the back bedroom, find the box." "How do you draw them around to the west?" Elias paused. "I need a distraction," he said. Clara looked at him. "I'll do it," she said. "I was thinking a rock thrown against—" "Mr. Crow," her voice was quiet and firm, "I know these men. Some of them know me. A rock doesn't panic experienced men. But a woman alone in the dark, calling out for help, that gets them moving in the wrong direction." She held his gaze. "I can do this." He looked at her for a long moment. "You stay at the tree line," he said. "You do not let them get close enough to grab you. If it starts going wrong, you run north. You don't wait for me. And you'll be inside. Give me the signal. I'll be moving the second you draw them." She nodded once. He gripped her arm briefly, just a second, just enough to say something he didn't have words for, and then let go. And they split in the dark, her going wide around to the north, him moving east toward the cellar doors. He got into position. He waited. Then he heard her voice lift out of the darkness to the north, calling out in a frightened, bewildered cry, "Hello? Is someone there? Please, I'm lost. I need help." And exactly as she had predicted, he heard boots on the porch and voices, and the 2 men moving, the creak of the porch steps, the sound of them going around the far side. He moved. The cellar door was unlocked, no reason to lock a root cellar on a property they thought they controlled, and he was inside and through and up the interior stairs and into the house in under a minute. He found the back bedroom by memory from Clara's description, past the main room, past the kitchen, last door on the right. 3rd board from the north wall. He counted in the dark by feel. Found the knot, pressed it, felt the board shift, lifted it. His hand closed on cold metal. He had the tin box in his coat, and he was back at the cellar stairs when he heard the voices returning to the porch, louder now and irritated, and he heard one of them say, probably just some lost rancher's wife, "Not worth chasing into the dark," and he was already moving, already out the cellar door and pulling it closed behind him, already melting back into the tree line. He found Clara where she was supposed to be. She was breathing fast, and her eyes were sharp and bright in the dark. "You got it," she whispered. He held up the tin box. She made a sound, half breath, half something he couldn't name, and she pressed one hand briefly against the box, as if she needed to feel that it was real. Her fingers pressed against the metal, and in the darkness he saw her close her eyes for just a second. "My father's," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She opened her eyes, straightened. "Let's go," she said. They moved back into the dark, and the farmhouse sat behind them, and the men on the porch never knew a thing, and the mountain and the night swallowed them whole. Above the valley, the stars were fierce and cold and burning, and somewhere in the dark, Elias Crow was beginning to understand something about himself that he had spent 8 years trying to avoid. That he was not, after all, a man who could simply walk away. Especially not from this, especially not from her. They moved through the dark for nearly an hour, before either of them spoke. Elias kept the pace steady, not rushing, not careless, watching the tree line and listening to the mountain the way a man did when he'd spent 15 years learning its language. Ranger walked without complaint, carrying Clara with the quiet patience that had made Elias trust that horse above most people. The tin box was inside Elias's coat, pressed against his ribs, and every few minutes he felt the edge of it and reminded himself it was still there. Clara didn't ask questions. She didn't fill the silence with nervous talk. She rode, and she watched, and she let him navigate, which told him she understood that this was his territory, and she was smart enough to respect that. When the cabin came into view through the trees, he felt something in his shoulders ease that he hadn't realized was tight. He helped her down from the saddle and she didn't protest the help this time, which told him her legs were probably more tired than she was willing to admit. He got Ranger settled and came inside to find her already sitting at the table with the lamp lit and her hands folded in front of her, waiting. He set the tin box on the table between them. She looked at it. She didn't reach for it immediately. "My father built that box," she said. "He was good with his hands, better than most men I knew." "What was he like?" She looked up, like the question surprised her. Like she hadn't expected him to ask. "Stubborn," she said. "Careful. He believed in things. Property and honesty, and doing what you said you were going to do." She paused. "He never once looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. He looked at me like I was his daughter, his partner." Her jaw worked briefly. Not everyone did. Elias didn't say anything to that. He pulled out his pocket knife and offered her the handle. She took it, and she used the tip to work open the latch on the box, and the lid came up on a smell of old paper and iron and something faintly floral, some dried herb, lavender maybe, that someone had placed inside years ago to keep the damp out. Inside was a neat stack of documents, folded and tied with plain string, and below those a small notebook with a cracked leather cover, and below that a folded letter sealed with wax that had long since gone brittle and cracked at the edges. Clara lifted the documents out and untied the string with careful hands. She unfolded the first one and laid it flat on the table. Elias leaned over to look. Even without Roy Cassell's trained eye, he could see the difference immediately. This paper was old, genuinely old. The edges darkened. The ink faded to the brownish color that only time produced, the handwriting the careful copperplate of an educated man working seriously. The seal at the bottom was embossed, official, real. "Original deed," Clara said. "Filed 1863, witnessed by the county registrar and 2 independent parties." She pointed to the names at the bottom. "Neither of these men has any connection to Nathaniel. Neither of them is still alive, but their families are. These signatures are known and on record, and Nathaniel's papers. His papers are dated 1869. He claims my father signed over partial rights during a period of financial difficulty." She folded the deed back carefully. "My father was not in financial difficulty in 1869. He had his best harvests in 68 and 69, and he would never have borrowed from Nathaniel under any circumstances. They despised each other. Can you prove the financial part?" "The notebook." She lifted the cracked leather notebook and opened it to the middle. "My father kept accounts every year, every transaction. Income, outlay, loans given and received. It reads like a bank ledger. 1869 is here." She turned to the year and placed her finger on the page. "No loans received, no debts outstanding. Surplus carried over into the following year." She looked up. "A man who forged those papers didn't count on the man keeping records like this." Elias looked at the notebook, at the careful close columns of numbers and dates and annotations in a hand that was clearly practiced from years of use. "Your father was a thorough man," he said. "He trusted paper more than people." A ghost of something moved across her face. "He used to say that a man's word was only as good as what he was willing to write down and sign." Smart he was. She closed the notebook and set it carefully back in the box. "Mr. Crow, these documents are enough. Any honest surveyor or land agent can see the difference between these and whatever Nathaniel produced. The question is getting them in front of someone with authority to act on them. Roy Castle, Elias said. You said he was a territorial surveyor. Was retired. But he knows documents and he has standing. His certifications are still valid. If he can look at these and Nathaniel's papers together and write up a formal comparison, that's something a federal marshal or a traveling judge can work with. And you trust him? I trust him, Elias said, which is something I don't say about many people. Clara looked at him steadily. Including me, he met her eyes. I don't know you well enough yet to say that. She absorbed that without flinching. Fair enough, she said. At least you're honest. I generally am. It's easier to track than the alternative. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. But close. He put more wood on the fire and told her to sleep, that they'd ride to Cassell's place at first light, and she didn't argue. He could see the exhaustion pulling at her. 3 days, without water or food, didn't leave a person immediately, no matter how much they willed it away. She took the bed again, and he took the floor, and the cabin went quiet, and this time, when he heard her shift in the night, he didn't think it was weeping. He thought it was simply a person finally warm enough and safe enough that her body was remembering how to rest. He lay awake longer than he expected. He kept thinking about the deed in that box. About a man who had built something real and left it to his daughter and trusted the world to honor that. And about all the ways the world had failed that trust and kept failing it, and how Clara Whitmore had kept fighting anyway. He thought about Margaret. About the land they had talked about homesteading before she died. About the plans that had dissolved in that frozen Wyoming winter. He made himself stop thinking about it, and eventually he slept. Roy Cassell lived on the North Ridge in a low, wide cabin that looked like it was half buried in the hillside, which was more or less accurate. He'd built it that way on purpose, he said, because he was done with weather and people in equal measure, and the hillside kept both of them at a manageable distance. He was 63 years old and had the lean, watchful quality of a man who had spent decades measuring things and didn't trust anything that couldn't be quantified. He opened his door at the sound of Ranger's approach and stood in the frame with his rifle loose in one hand and his eyes sharp, and when he saw it was Elias, he lowered the rifle without quite fully relaxing. "Crow," he said, "you look like you slept on the ground." "I did," Elias said. "She needs your expertise." Roy looked at Clara with the appraising directness of a man who had no patience for social performance. He looked at her hands, at her torn sleeve, at her face, and he said, "You the Whitmore woman Voss has been making noise about?" "I am," Clara said. Her voice was even, "and I have documentation that proves he's been lying." Roy was quiet for a moment. "Come in then," he said. "Coffee's on." It took Roy Cassell 40 minutes to go through the documents. He did it in silence, methodically. Moving between the papers Clara had brought and the photographs of Nathaniel's papers and this was the part that had surprised Elias. Roy had actually already requested and received from the county land office 6 weeks ago, when rumors about the Whitmore dispute had reached him and bothered him enough to look into it. "I had a feeling about those papers when I first heard the description," Roy said without looking up from what he was reading. "Paper composition, ink aging, the kind of thing a forger relies on most people not knowing how to identify." He turned over one of Nathaniel's documents and held it at an angle toward the light. "This aging is chemical. Somebody treated this paper to make it look older than it is." "Good job, not perfect." He set it down. "The seal is the bigger problem. It's a reproduction of the county registrar's seal from 1869, but the registrar changed his seal design in 1867. This design was retired 2 years before the date on this document." The room went quiet. Clara said, "That means whoever made this document didn't do their research carefully enough." Roy set the paper down and looked up at both of them. "With your documents and mine, and a written statement from me about the technical analysis, this is a clear case of forgery and fraudulent land claim." He paused. "Who do you plan to take it to?" "Missoula," Elias said. "Federal marshal. That's 2 days, and Voss will know she's gone inside of one." Roy leaned back in his chair. He's got people watching roads. Then we go around the roads. You'd add a day. Better a day than walking into one of his men. Roy looked at Clara. You up for 3 days in the mountain trails, miss? Clara looked back at him without hesitation. I've been up for considerably worse recently, she said. When do we leave? Roy almost smiled. It was a brief, dry expression that didn't quite make it all the way to his eyes, but it was close. Tomorrow at first light gives me time to write up the analysis and get it notarized. I've got temporary notary authority through the territorial office. Tonight you stay here. He looked at Elias, both of you. We didn't ask for charity, Elias said. No, you asked for expertise and I'm giving it along with a floor to sleep on. Don't make it sentimental. It was late that evening, while Roy was at his writing table working on the formal analysis, and Elias was outside with Ranger, that Clara found herself alone by the fire with her thoughts, which was not a comfortable place to be. She had spent the last 2 years learning to live in the silence of other people's contempt. She had learned to move through a town that looked at her size before it looked at her face, that heard Nathaniel's stories before it heard her truth, that had decided what she was, and stuck to that decision with the stubborn rigidity of people who didn't like having their certainties disturbed. She had learned to take up less room in conversations, to speak carefully, measuring every word for how it might be used against her. To never ask for help, because asking for help meant exposing a need, and needs were ammunition in the hands of the wrong people. In 3 days, she had been locked in a box, rescued by a stranger, broken into her own home in the dark, and was now sitting in another stranger's cabin, waiting to ride mountain trails to Missoula on the hope that a federal marshal would look at a forged seal and do something about it. She should have been frightened. She was frightened. But underneath the fear was something else, something she had almost forgotten how to feel, which was the specific sensation of moving forward instead of being moved. The cabin door opened and Elias came back in from outside, bringing the cold mountain air with him, and he moved to the fire and held his hands out to it without immediately speaking. Ranger settled, he said after a moment. Good horse, Clara said. Best I've known. Silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable. Just the fire and the sound of Roy's pen moving across paper in the other room. Mr. Crow said. He glanced at her sideways. We've broken into a house together in the dark. You can use my given name. She absorbed that. Elias, she said. What happens if the marshal doesn't act? He was quiet for a moment. Then we find another way. What other way? I don't know yet. But there's usually one. He turned and looked at her directly. What I know is that you've got a legitimate deed, a falsified competing document, and a certified surveyor willing to put his name on a technical analysis proving the forgery. That's not a weak case, Miss Whitmore. He stopped. Corrected himself. Clara, that's not a weak case. She noticed the correction. She didn't remark on it. Nathaniel has money, she said, and influence. And he's had months to prepare his story. He's also a man who believed he'd never have to answer for any of it, Elias said. Men like that get sloppy, they get overconfident. Roy just found a slipped seal date on a document Nathaniel probably paid good money for. That's not careful work. That's the work of a man who expected the whole thing to be over before anyone looked too closely. She turned that over in her mind. You think he underestimated me, she said. I think he underestimated what you'd be willing to fight for, Elias said. There's a difference. He looked at you and he saw a woman alone, without money, without allies, in a town he controlled. He saw a problem that could be solved with a locked door and a few days of discomfort. He paused. He didn't account for what was actually inside you. Clara looked at the fire. She felt the words, the way you felt something heavy that had been resting on you for a long time, felt the shape of it lifting, just slightly. People have been telling me what they see when they look at me my entire life, she said quietly. And it was never anything good, too large, too slow. Too much to handle, not enough to count. She let out a slow breath. After enough years of it, you start to wonder if they're right. They weren't, Elias said. You've known me 2 days. I've known you long enough, he said. and I've known enough people to recognize the difference." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, which made it easier to take the words seriously. He wasn't performing kindness. He wasn't being careful with her. He was just saying what he believed. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. So she set it aside and kept it and said thank you for meaning that. He nodded once and didn't make anything of it, which was the right thing to do. They left at first light, the three of them, Roy with his leather document satchel, Clara on Ranger with Elias walking beside, and they took the high trail north and west, the one that skirted the main valley road by a full mile. The one that most people didn't know existed, unless they'd spent years learning the mountain. It was a hard trail, steep in places, narrow in others, with stretches that required single file and careful footing. Clara rode without complaint and dismounted when she needed to, which was twice on the steepest pitches, and she walked those sections herself, without asking for help and without falling behind. Roy watched her and said nothing, which from Roy was something close to approval. On the second hour of riding, Elias stopped. He stopped without warning, going still in a way that made Ranger immediately still behind him, and he held up one hand with his palm back. Both Clara and Roy went quiet, voices ahead on the trail. Men's voices, low, the particular sound of people who believed they were alone. Elias turned and came back to them fast and quiet. He leaned in close and spoke low. Two men 20 yards up, around the bend. Armed, he looked at Roy. Vosses? Could be. He has men who know the high trails. He knows we'd avoid the main road, Clara said. Her voice was barely a breath. He's covering the alternatives. Elias looked at her. You recognize voices? She listened for a moment. Then her face changed. Something sharp moved through it. The bigger voice, she said quietly. That's Draper. Hank Draper. He works for Nathaniel directly. He was one of the men who put me in that cabin. The air between them got very still. Elias looked at the trail ahead. Looked back the way they came, made a calculation. There's a cutoff, he said. 50 yards back. Takes us higher and east. Longer, but it keeps us off this trail entirely. How much longer? Roy asked. 3 hours. Roy looked mildly pained but said nothing. We go, Elias said. We don't engage. We don't need any additional complications right now. He was already turning them around when Clara said, very quietly, he's going to hear about a woman on the high trail either way. Voss has enough eyes out here, maybe, Elias said. But maybe and certain aren't the same thing, and I'd rather have maybe. She didn't argue. They went back and took the cutoff, climbing higher into terrain that bit back with wind and loose rock and an altitude that made Roy breathe harder than he would have liked. Clara rode and didn't complain and watched the trail behind them with careful, steady eyes, and twice she put a hand on Elias's arm without words when she thought she heard something. And both times he stopped and listened, and both times the sound resolved into wind or animals. The third time she touched his arm, and they stopped and listened. It wasn't wind. It was a single rider, moving fast on the lower trail heading north. They held still in the trees until the sound faded. He's going to Missoula ahead of us, Clara said. Her voice was flat and certain. Elias looked at her. You sure? Nathaniel doesn't send one man riding hard north unless he's trying to get ahead of something. She met Elias's eyes. He knows we have the documents. Somehow he knows. The farmhouse, Roy said quietly. If his men went to check the box and found it gone, then he knows exactly what we have and where we're going with it, Elias finished. The wind moved through the trees around them. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest that wasn't the altitude. Nathaniel Voss had always been ahead of her. He had always known what she was going to do before she did it, because he had people everywhere, and she had no one. She had spent 2 years watching him move the pieces around her and never being able to stop it. She thought about the locked door, about the dark inside that cabin, about the sound her own fists made against wood that didn't give. Then we move faster, she said. Both men looked at her. He sent one rider. If that man reaches Missoula and talks to whoever Nathaniel has there before we do, he can control the story. He's controlled every story up to now. Her voice was steady and hard, and she felt the steadiness of it surprise her even as she spoke. "We have the documents and we have Roy's analysis, and those things are real and provable, and they are on our side. But only if we get there first." She looked at Elias. "How much can we close the gap?" Elias looked at the terrain ahead. "Roy," he said, "how's your riding?" "I will not dignify that with an answer," Roy said. "Let's move." They came down off the high trail in the early afternoon of the second day, and they were tired and cold, and Roy's hands were stiff from the altitude, and Clara's legs were aching in ways she wasn't admitting out loud, and none of it slowed them down. Elias had pushed the pace, and they had kept it, and the result was that they came into the outskirts of Missoula in the mid-afternoon, which was a full 5 hours ahead of what the slower route would have allowed. Whether it was enough, they didn't know yet. The federal marshal's office sat on the main street, a solid brick building that looked like it had been built by someone who believed in permanence. Elias tied Ranger out front, and the three of them went in, and the deputy at the front desk looked up at them with the mild wariness that was the standard response to strangers appearing without appointment. "We need to see Marshal Hendricks," Elias said, "today." "Marshal's occupied." "With who?" Elias said. His voice hadn't changed in volume or temperature, but something in it made the deputy reconsider his next sentence. The deputy looked at the three of them, at Roy's document satchel, at Clara, who was standing very straight, and looking at the door to the inner office with the expression of a woman who had already decided that door was going to open. "There's a man from Harlan Creek in with him now," the deputy said carefully. "Came in about 2 hours ago." Clara felt the air go out of her lungs. 2 hours. Nathaniel's rider had been here 2 hours. She looked at Elias. He looked back at her, and his expression was controlled and level, and she could read exactly nothing from it, which she was beginning to understand meant he was thinking hard and fast. "What's the man's name?" Elias asked the deputy. "He gave it as McCreary. Said he represented a property dispute. He represents a criminal enterprise." Roy stepped forward for the first time, and his voice carried 60 years of professional authority like a physical weight. "My name is Roy Cassell. I hold territorial surveyor credentials through the Montana Land Office. I hold temporary notary authority through the same office. And I have in this satchel a certified technical analysis demonstrating that documents submitted by a man named Nathaniel Voss of Harlan Creek are deliberate forgeries of official county records." He held the deputy's gaze. "You are going to open that door. Tell Marshal Hendricks that Roy Castle is here on a matter of criminal fraud, and you are going to do it before that man in there has one more minute to finish telling whatever story he came to tell." The deputy stared at him. He got up. He knocked on the inner door. And the door opened. Marshal Thomas Hendricks was 55 years old, built like a man who had been in law enforcement long enough to have made peace with everything but dishonesty. And he looked at the three people who came into his office with the careful, neutral attention of someone who had learned not to decide things before he heard them. McCreary, a lean, watchful man in good boots who Elias pegged immediately as someone paid well to look respectable, started to protest. "Marshal, I came here on behalf of—" "You'll get your chance," Hendricks said. He looked at Roy. "Mr. Cassell, I know your work. Sit down." McCreary's mouth closed. They sat, and Clara Whitmore, who had been told her whole life that she didn't belong at any table that mattered, spread her father's documents on a federal marshal's desk and began to talk. She spoke clearly. She spoke without apology. She laid out the timeline from the day her father died to the moment she had pounded her fists raw against a locked door in the dark. And she did it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it. Not because she needed to remember, she remembered every detail, but because she had spent 2 years waiting for someone with authority to listen. And she was not going to waste a single word of it. When she finished, the room was quiet. Hendricks looked at Roy's analysis. He took his time with it. McCreary had gone very still in a way that could have meant confidence, and could have meant the opposite, and Elias, sitting with his arms resting on his knees and his eyes on the marshal's face, thought it was the opposite. Hendricks set the papers down. He looked at McCreary. "The seal date discrepancy," he said. "How do you account for it?" McCreary said, "There may have been a clerical error on a notarized legal document that happens to make the document appear to post-date the seal design that was actually in use." Hendrix's voice hadn't changed. "It didn't need to, Mr. McCreary. I'm going to ask you to wait in the outer office." A beat. Marcia, that wasn't a request. McCreary left. When the door closed behind him, Hendrix looked at Clara for a long moment. Something in his expression had shifted, not dramatically, not sentimentally, just the specific way a face changed when a man who had seen a lot of dishonest things was looking at something that was, straightforwardly, true. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm going to need 2 days to confirm these documents through the Territorial Records Office. I'm asking you to stay in Missoula during that time, accessible if I have further questions." "Yes, sir," she said. "During those 2 days, Nathaniel Voss is not to be contacted, warned, or otherwise informed of this meeting by anyone in this room. Mr. McCreary is going to be asked not to leave the city, and I'm going to have a conversation with him about his own potential exposure in this matter." He paused. "At the end of 2 days, if the records confirm what your documents indicate, I will personally ride to Harlan Creek." Clara said, "And the land?" "Fraud vitiates the claim," Hendrix said. "If the forgery is confirmed, Voss's papers are void. Your deed stands as filed." The room was quiet again. Clara looked at the documents on the desk, at her father's careful copperplate handwriting, at the seal that was real and had been real since 1863 and had never stopped being real, no matter what Nathaniel Voss had put in front of it. She thought about 2 years of being called worthless, of fences cut in the night and rumors spread like dry rot, of a locked door in the dark and raw hands and the specific sound of fists against wood when you had no voice left. She thought about Elias Crow standing in that doorway with the light behind him, holding out a canteen, saying nobody deserved to die behind a locked door. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs beneath the desk, where no one could see, and she kept her face steady, and she said, "Thank you, Marshal." Hendrix nodded. He began gathering the documents carefully. Then he said without looking up, "Miss Whitmore, for what it's worth, you put a strong case together. Strong enough that I'd have listened to it without the surveyor's analysis. It was a small thing. It was also the first time in 2 years that anyone in a position of authority had looked at her and told her she had done something right. She held that quietly, like something fragile, and did not let it crack. Outside the marshal's office, on the front step in the cold Missoula afternoon, Roy shook both their hands with the brisk economy of a man who communicated in actions rather than words. Said he needed a bed and a meal and not to be spoken to for 12 hours, and walked off up the street. Clara and Elias stood in the quiet. "He listened," she said. "He did. I didn't know if he would. I thought he would," Elias said. "But I wasn't certain." She looked at him sideways. "You seemed certain. Seemed as important work sometimes." A sound escaped her. It wasn't quite a laugh. She was too tired and too wrung out for a full laugh, but it was the shape of one. The architecture of something lighter than anything she'd felt in a very long time. Elias looked at her when he heard it, and something moved in his expression that he didn't bother to hide this time. Just for a second. Then it settled back into his usual steadiness. "We need a place to stay," he said, "and food and sleep." "In that order?" "Maybe not the first two," he said. "Come on." They walked up the street side by side. The mountain man who had spent 8 years avoiding the world, and the woman the world had spent years trying to erase, and the Missoula afternoon was cold and gray, and neither of them remarked on it. And for the first time since she had found herself on the floor of that locked cabin, Clara Whitmore felt something she recognized slowly, the way you recognize something you'd been without long enough that you'd half forgotten its name. She felt like herself, not the self the town had tried to convince her she was. Not the burden, not the problem, not the woman who was too large and too stubborn and too much to bother with. The self her father had believed in. The self that had kept hitting a locked door for 3 days because the alternative was giving up, and that was the one thing she had never been willing to do. She walked, and the cold came down from the mountains, and behind her the marshal's office held her father's documents safe on a federal desk. and ahead of her were 2 more days before she would know what justice looked like in this particular corner of the world. But she was walking, and that was not nothing. That was in fact everything. The 2 days in Missoula moved the way time moved when you were waiting for something that mattered, slow in the hours and fast in the looking back. Elias found them rooms at a boarding house 2 streets over from the marshal's office, a clean and unremarkable place run by a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who asked no questions and made a substantial breakfast, and those 2 qualities made her, in Elias's estimation, close to ideal. Clara took the room at the end of the hall, and Elias took the one beside it, and Roy Cassell disappeared into his own room, and was not seen until the following morning, at which point he appeared at the breakfast table, looking considerably more human. Clara slept for 11 hours the first night. She knew because she looked at the clock when she lay down, and she looked at it when she woke, and for a long moment she didn't know where she was. And then she remembered, and the remembering was not the cold fear she expected, but something more complicated, the specific feeling of a person who has been moving so fast for so long that stopping feels almost dangerous. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling, and thought about Nathaniel Voss sitting in Harlan Creek right now, probably confident that his man McCreary had handled things, probably already thinking past this to the next step, the signing, the transfer, the clean legal fiction that would make her father's land his. She thought about how certain he had always been, how he had never once in 2 years acted like a man who expected to lose. She got up. She washed her face. She went downstairs and found Elias already at the table with coffee and a map of Harlan Creek spread in front of him, and she sat down across from him without preamble and said, "He doesn't know yet." Elias looked up. "McCreary's still here. Marshall's keeping him. So Nathaniel is sitting at home thinking everything is fine. For now, what happens when Hendricks rides in?" Elias turned his coffee cup once. Depends on how Nathaniel plays it. He could cooperate, claim confusion, try to paint himself as the victim of a misunderstanding. Or he could push back hard. He paused. "My read on him is he pushes back." "He always pushes back," Clara said. "It's all he knows. He's never had to do anything else." She looked at the map. "He has people in that town, the sheriff, at least 3 or 4 others who owe him favors or money. If Hendricks rides in alone—" "He won't ride in alone," Roy said from the doorway, moving to the table and pouring himself coffee without waiting to be invited. "A federal marshal executing on a fraud investigation brings deputies. It's procedure. Hendricks knows what he's walking into." "Does he know about the sheriff?" "I told him," Elias said. "Yesterday afternoon while you were sleeping. I went back to his office and told him everything I knew about how Vossi operated in Harlan Creek, and who was likely compromised." He held her gaze. He listened. Clara absorbed that. The fact that he had done it without telling her, without making anything of it, without asking for acknowledgement. He had just done it because it needed doing. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and looked back at the map and didn't make more of it than that, which was exactly the right thing. Marshal Hendricks sent for them on the morning of the second day, and they went. He was standing when they came in, which was different from the first meeting, and there was a deputy with him, a solid, quiet man named Briggs, who had the look of someone who had done difficult things and expected to do more. "Territorial Records Office confirmed the original deed filing this morning," Hendricks said, without greeting. Just straight to it, which Clara appreciated. "The Registrar's archive has the original entry from 1863, signature and seal, matching exactly what you presented. Cross-referenced with the county clerk's files in Harlan Creek, there is no record of any subsequent modification, transfer, or encumbrance on that property." He paused. Mr. Cassell's analysis of the seal discrepancy on Voss's documents is supported by the Territorial Office's own records that seal design was officially retired in June of 1867. Nobody in the room said anything. Hendricks continued. "McCreary has been offered a reduced exposure in exchange for a full statement about his involvement and Voss's instructions to him. He accepted this morning." A pause. "His statement includes details about how the forged documents were produced, who was paid to witness them, and what Nathaniel Voss planned to do with the property, once he obtained the signed transfer. What did he plan? Clara asked. Hendricks looked at her steadily. Sell it. He had a buyer from the railroad already. Land acquisition for a planned line through the valley. The purchase price was substantial. He let that settle. He was never interested in the land for its own sake. He wanted it because a railroad agent offered him money for it, and he saw an opportunity. The room went quiet with a specific quality of quiet. Clara thought about her father, about 20 years of work on that land, about the creek valley and the soil he had described to her when she was young, told her about its composition like he was introducing her to a person. About the winter he had worked through a broken wrist because the cattle needed tending and there was nobody else. She thought about Nathaniel sitting across from a railroad agent and discussing it in dollars. She kept her face still. When do you ride? Elias asked. Today, Hendricks said. This afternoon. I want to be in Harlan Creek by tomorrow morning, and I want Voss to have as little time to prepare as possible. McCreary had a man here watching the office. I had him picked up this morning, so Voss has no information about what's happened. As far as he knows, McCreary is still working on his behalf. Something that might have been dry satisfaction moved briefly across Hendricks's face. I'd like you three to ride with us. Miss Whitmore as the complainant. Mr. Cassell as the certifying expert. He looked at Elias. You found her. You retrieved the documents, and frankly, you know that valley better than any of my deputies. I'll ride, Elias said. We leave at 2. There were 6 of them riding south out of Missoula. Hendricks, Briggs, 2 more deputies whose names were Walsh and Petrie, and Elias and Clara. Roy Cassell rode as far as the edge of the city and then turned north for his ridge, saying he'd provided everything he had to provide and he was too old for dramatic confrontations, and nobody argued with him. They made good time. Hendricks set a pace that was efficient without being punishing, and the deputies were experienced riders who didn't need managing. Clara rode beside Elias and said little, and he said little, and the mountain country moved past them in the long autumn light. Somewhere in the second hour, she said, I keep thinking about what I'm going to say to him. To Voss? Yes, Elias glanced at her. You don't have to say anything to him. I know. She was quiet for a moment, but I've been practicing conversations in my head for 2 years. Every time he did something, cut my fence, spread a story, showed up with those papers, I'd think about what I would say if I could. What the right words were. She paused. Now that I'm actually going to be in the same room with him, I don't know what any of those words were. What do you want him to understand? She thought about it seriously. That I'm still here, she said finally. That's all. Just that. He looked at her for a moment. I think that'll come across clearly. They rode. They came into Harlan Creek the next morning, just as the town was opening itself up to the day. Clara had not been back since Nathaniel's men had taken her off the road. Being back felt strange in a way she hadn't anticipated, familiar and wrong at the same time, like a word in your own language suddenly sounding foreign. She knew every building. She knew the angle of the morning light on the general store's front window. She knew the sound the creek made from 2 streets away. She also felt every eye that turned toward them. 6 riders coming in together with a man wearing a federal marshal's badge drew attention. It was the kind of attention that spread fast and brought people to doorways and windows, the way it always did in small places where news was the primary currency. Clara sat straight in the saddle and looked ahead, and did not look at any of the faces. Elias was on her left. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence was the thing, the physical fact of him beside her, steady, unhurried, not looking at the faces either, but not because he was avoiding them. Because he simply didn't care what they thought. He never had. She borrowed some of that, just for the moment. Hendricks went directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cale Dobbins was a man who had held his position for 11 years and had held it, for the last 4 at least, largely by the grace of Nathaniel Voss's goodwill. He was not a violent man, which Clara had always thought was the most confusing thing about him. He had allowed a great deal of harm without ever doing it directly himself. He had simply looked the other way at strategic moments, filled in the appropriate paperwork, and made sure his responses to Clara's complaints had been thorough enough to look like effort while resulting in nothing. He opened his door to Hendrix's knock, and his face did three things in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and something that was trying very hard to be professional calm and not quite making it. "Marshal Hendrix," he said, "this is unexpected." "It tends to be," Hendrix said. "May we come in?" They came in. Hendrix was clean and direct. He laid out the situation with the efficient precision of a man who had done this before, and didn't need drama to make his point. The documents, the forgery analysis, McCreary's statement, the territorial record confirmation. He put each piece on Dobbins's desk, as he named it, like cards being laid down in a game where the hand was already decided. Dobbins's face went through several more changes during this recitation. By the end, he had arrived at a carefully constructed neutrality that Clara recognized as a man deciding how to survive. "I want to be fully cooperative with a federal investigation," Dobbins said. "Good," Hendrix said. "Then you'll accompany us to Nathaniel Voss's property, and you won't send word ahead of us." A beat. "Of course," Dobbins said. Nathaniel Voss's house was the largest property in the valley, as he had always intended it to be. He had built it to be seen, to communicate something about the kind of man he was and the kind of power he held, and Clara had spent her childhood finding it impressive, and her adulthood finding it exhausting. When they rode up, Nathaniel was on the front porch. This told Clara something immediately. He was dressed and out, and watching the road this early, which meant someone had warned him after all. Not McCreary, not his Missoula watcher, both accounted for. Someone else. Someone in Harlan Creek who had seen the riders come in and put the pieces together fast enough to get a message out ahead of them. Nathaniel Voss was 61 years old and had the particular kind of confidence that came from never having faced a consequence that cost him anything real. He was a tall man, broad across the chest, with a gray beard kept short and careful, and he dressed with the deliberate prosperity of a man who wanted you to measure yourself against what you saw. He had three men standing behind him on the porch who were not there by coincidence. He looked at the riders. His eyes went to Hendrix's badge. Moved to Roy's absence, moved to Clara. His expression didn't change. That was the thing Clara noticed first. After everything, after the documents, after McCreary, after whatever his source had told him in the last hour, he still looked like a man who expected to win. Hendrix dismounted. Clara and Elias dismounted behind him. "Mr. Voss," Hendrix said. "Marshal Thomas Hendrix, Federal Marshal's Office, out of Missoula. I have some questions for you regarding a property dispute and associated documentation." "Always happy to cooperate with the law," Nathaniel said. His voice was warm and easy, though I'm not sure what questions remain. "My representative in Missoula should have provided everything you need." "Your representative provided quite a lot," Hendrix said evenly. "That's actually part of what I'd like to discuss." Something moved behind Nathaniel's eyes, small, controlled. "Gone quickly, of course," he said. "Come in." "We'll conduct this out here," Hendrix said. "I prefer the open air." Another small pause. Then Nathaniel spread his hands generously. "As you like." He came down off the porch steps. His three men came with him, staying slightly behind, which Elias noted and positioned himself accordingly, moving to a place that was casual in appearance and strategic in fact. Hendrix began. He was methodical. He walked through the document analysis, the seal discrepancy, the territorial record confirmation. He described McCreary's statement in sufficient detail that it was clear to anyone listening how comprehensive it was. He kept his voice level and professional throughout, the kind of voice that didn't give Nathaniel anything to push against emotionally. Nathaniel listened. He kept his face arranged in an expression of calm, reasonable attention. He nodded at appropriate moments. He looked like a man following along with something mildly interesting. When Hendrix paused, Nathaniel said, "I'm concerned about the reliability of McCreary's account. He's a man with his own interests, and if he's been offered reduced exposure..." The account is corroborated by the territorial records and by the technical analysis from a certified surveyor, Hendricks said. The corroboration doesn't rely on McCurry alone. Even so, a retired surveyor on a ridge somewhere with respect. Roy Cassell's credentials are current, and his analysis is technically sound. The territorial office has independently confirmed the seal discrepancy. Hendricks's voice didn't change. Voss, I'd like to move past the document question and ask you directly about the incident 3 weeks ago. Specifically about Miss Whitmore's confinement. Nathaniel's eyes moved to Clara. It was the first time he had looked directly at her since they arrived, and the look was she had expected contempt, or anger, or the particular cold dismissal he had used on her for 2 years. What she actually saw was something she hadn't anticipated. Calculation, pure cold still working calculation. He was still figuring out the angles, even now, even with a federal marshal in front of him and McCreary's statement on record and the territorial office's confirmation already in writing. He was still looking for the play. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Nathaniel said. I've been concerned about Clara. She's been under considerable strain since her father passed. I've tried to help her. She was locked in a storage cabin on the old mining road, Hendricks said. For 3 days, without water. That's Nathaniel shifted. I don't know anything about that. Mr. Crow, Hendricks said without turning. Elias stepped forward. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. I found her on the afternoon of the 23rd, he said. The door had a padlock on it not original to the structure, recently installed. The lock was purchased from the general store in Harlan Creek 4 days prior. The store owner's records show the purchase. The purchaser signed for it. He held the paper out to Hendricks. Name on the record is Hank Draper. Who your own men, Sheriff. He glanced at Dobbins, identified this morning as a man employed directly by Mr. Voss. Dobbins had gone the color of old ash. Nathaniel looked at Elias for the first time. And in that look, brief, controlled, gone quickly, Clara saw it. The thing underneath the confidence. The thing he had always kept very carefully, where nobody could see it. Fear, small, real, and new. I employ a number of men, Nathaniel said. His voice had changed by approximately 2 degrees. Nobody who didn't know what to listen for would have noticed. Clara noticed. What Draper does independently. Your men told me themselves, Clara said. Everyone looked at her. She hadn't planned to speak yet. The words came because they were true and because she was done waiting for the right moment, because the right moment was the one you made. When they put me in that cabin, she said, they told me it was on your orders. Those were the exact words. Hank Draper looked me in the face and said, your uncle says you'll come around once you've had a few days to think. That's a direct quote. I've had 3 weeks to make sure I had it exact. Nathaniel's face went still, not the controlled calm from earlier. Something different. The specific stillness of a man who has just understood that he miscalculated. One of his men on the porch shifted slightly, and Elias turned his head a 1/4 inch in that direction, and the man went still again. Mr. Voss, Hendricks said, I'm placing you under federal jurisdiction pending investigation of fraud and unlawful confinement. You'll surrender your sidearm, and your men will stand down. You don't have the authority. I have full authority in a matter of federal land fraud, Hendricks said. Which this is, your sidearm, sir. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which Nathaniel Voss stood on the ground outside his large house and looked at the federal marshal and the 2 deputies and Elias Crow and Clara Whitmore and made whatever calculation he was still capable of making. Then he reached slowly to his hip and handed over his weapon. Clara breathed. It was an involuntary thing, a breath she had been holding, apparently, since they had ridden up. It came out slow and quiet, and she felt Elias beside her without looking at him, and she did not let herself make any expression that Nathaniel could see. She would not give him that, but she breathed. What followed was not tidy. Nothing about justice was ever tidy. Hendricks took Nathaniel's formal statement, with Dobbins present, and Dobbins's own compliance with Voss over the years came apart in layers during the process. The way structures that have been built badly come apart not in one collapse but in pieces, each piece revealing the next. By the time the afternoon was half gone, Dobbins had provided a statement of his own, in exchange for the same deal McCreary had taken, and the picture that emerged from both statements together was considerably worse than Clara had known. The railroad deal was real and had been in progress for 8 months. The purchase price Nathaniel had been offered for her 20 acres, combined with several other parcels he had already acquired in the valley, was more money than most men in Harlan Creek would see in a decade. He had worked patiently and systematically, eliminating each obstacle, and Clara's refusal to sell had been the last one standing. He had been willing to lock a woman in a box without water for 3 days for that money. Hendricks shared this with her in the early evening, sitting across from her at the table in the Harlan Creek General Store, which its owner, a man named Pruitt, who had never been overtly cruel to Clara, but had also never been particularly brave, had offered as a meeting space with the specific energy of a man trying to be on the right side of things. Now that the right side was becoming more apparent. Clara listened to all of it. She kept her hands flat on the table. When Hendricks finished, she said, "The other parcels he already owns. The families he bought out, were those legitimate purchases?" Hendricks looked at her. "That's a good question. We'll be looking at them. Some of those people may have sold under pressure. They didn't feel they could resist," she said. "That's different from a willing sale." "It is," Hendricks said. "And it will be examined." She nodded. He gathered his papers. Then he said carefully, "Miss Whitmore, your land is yours. I'll have the formal order issued by end of week. Boss's claim is void and will be recorded as such." She said thank you, and meant it in ways she didn't entirely have words for. After Hendricks left, she sat alone at the table for a moment. The general store was quiet. Through the window she could see the street, and the people moving on it, and she was aware that the word was spreading. She could see it in how people looked at the store windows as they passed, in the specific quality of movement that said a town was processing new information. The door opened and Elias came in. He got 2 cups of coffee from Pruitt without asking and set one in front of her and sat down. "It's over," she said. "The main part of it," he said. "What's the other part?" He looked at her steadily. "Going home." She hadn't thought about that yet. Going home. The farmhouse, her land, the creek valley. Nathaniel's men were gone from the property. Hendricks had sent Briggs ahead to clear them out. It was hers again, just the way her father had left it. "It'll need work," she said. "They weren't careful with it." "You'll fix it, I will." She turned her coffee cup once. "You could," stopped. He waited. "You're welcome," she said carefully. "If you wanted to come by, see it. The land, it's good land." A pause. "My father would have wanted to thank you." Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coffee cup. Then he looked at her. "I'd like to see it," he said. She nodded once. Neither of them said anything else about it. Outside, the town of Harlan Creek was having a complicated day. The kind of day a town had when it was forced to look at something it had chosen not to look at before. Clara could feel it through the window, the specific discomfort of a community that had been complicit in something and was now reckoning with what that meant. She thought about all the times she had walked down that street and felt the weight of everyone's assessment. All the times she had gone into the post office or the general store and felt herself being measured and found wanting before she said a word. All the times Nathaniel's stories had been the story and her truth had been dismissed before she could speak it. She looked around the general store, at Pruitt behind his counter, who was making himself very busy with inventory. At the 2 women she knew slightly who had come in and were now finding reasons to linger. One of them, Dorothy Marsh, whose husband had sold Nathaniel a parcel of land 2 years ago, under circumstances that Clara now understood slightly differently, looked at her across the store and then looked away. Then looked back. She crossed the store. She was a woman in her 50s with the permanent tiredness of hard work and not enough of what made work worthwhile. "Clara," she said. She stopped, started again. "I should have said something. When he started spreading those stories, I knew your father." He was a good man and I knew he wouldn't have. She stopped again. I'm sorry. Clara looked at her for a moment. I know it's hard, Clara said finally. When a man like that has that much power, it's hard to be the one who stands against it. Dorothy's face worked. It's not an excuse. No, Clara said quietly. It's not. She didn't say anything else to soften it. But she didn't harden it further either. Dorothy nodded once, more to herself than to Clara, and went back to her shopping. Elias was watching her. She could feel it without looking. You could have said something kinder, he said, low, just between them. I could have said something crueler, she replied. This was the middle. He considered that. Fair enough. She looked at him. Does it bother you? What they did? What they let happen? Without hesitation. But you're not going. No, it's not mine to be angry for. His eyes were steady on hers. But yes, it bothers me. The honesty of that landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. The door opened again, and one of Hendrix's deputies, Walsh, appeared, and said the marshal wanted everyone for a final accounting before he turned in for the night. Clara stood, and Elias stood, and they went out into the street, and the evening had gone dark and cold, and the lamps were lit in windows up and down Harlan Creek, and people were watching them go. Not the way they used to watch her, not with the flat dismissal, or the barely disguised contempt, or the polite avoidance that was its own form of contempt. Something else. Something she didn't have quite a word for, and chose not to name just yet, because naming things too early had a way of making them fragile. But she felt it, and she kept walking. At the end of the street, before they reached Hendrix's temporary office in the church building, Clara stopped. She turned and looked back at the length of the town, the buildings, and she knew. The lamps in windows, the ordinary and painful and complicated place that had been her whole world for 27 years. She had walked through it all her life, carrying other people's opinions of her like stones in her pockets. She had adjusted her walk for it, adjusted her voice. Adjusted how much space she took up in rooms and conversations and her own imagination of what her life could be. She was still here. She was still the same woman who had pounded her fists bloody against a locked door because the alternative was unacceptable. She was still her father's daughter. You all right? Elias said beside her. Yes, she said, and then because it was true and he deserved the truth, and no. Both at the same time. He nodded like that made perfect sense. Like he had lived in that exact place for years and knew its geography well. That's about right, he said. She turned back toward the church building and the lights inside it, and she walked through the dark main street of Harlan Creek, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't adjust anything. She just walked, like the ground under her feet was hers. Because it was. The farmhouse smelled like strangers. That was the first thing Clara noticed when she pushed open the front door the morning after Hendrix made his final accounting. Nathaniel's men had been cleared out by Deputy Briggs the previous afternoon. And they had gone without incident. Men who worked for pay rather than conviction rarely fought hard when the pay stopped, but they had left behind the particular residue of people who hadn't cared about a place. Boot mud ground into the floor her father had laid. A broken chair pushed into the corner, dishes used and left. The smell of tobacco smoked indoors when her father had never once allowed it. She stood in the doorway and breathed through it. Elias was behind her, a step back, giving her the moment without being asked. She walked in. She went through every room the way you went through something that had been violated, carefully, cataloging, letting yourself feel each thing, without letting any single thing stop you. The kitchen was manageable. The main room was worse. The back bedroom, her father's room, had been used as a storage space for equipment, and she had to move a rusted saddle rack off the bed frame before she could see the floor, and when she saw the floor, the third board from the north wall. The knot on its right side, the empty space where the tin box had lived, she felt something tight and painful move through her chest and then release. The box was in Missoula, safe, its contents documented and recorded with the federal marshal's office. Her father's work was safe. She pressed her hand flat on the floor for a moment. Just for a moment. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen and started making a list. Elias watched her work and said nothing, which was the correct response to watching someone reclaim a thing they loved. He helped where he was asked, and stayed out of the way when he wasn't, and by the time midday came around, they had cleared the main room and the kitchen, gotten a fire going in the stove, and established that structurally the house was sound. Nathaniel's men had been careless, not destructive. The difference mattered. The fence line on the east side is cut in 3 places, Clara said. She was looking at a small map she had drawn from memory. The cattle that were on the property, when I left, I don't know where they are. They could have drifted. They could have been taken. We'll find out, Elias said. The garden is a loss for this season. I knew that before I came back. The kitchen stores are cleaned out. She made another mark. The tool shed is intact, which is the most important thing. And the creek is stopped. The creek is fine. That's not something they could take. He looked at the list over her shoulder. It was substantial. It was also organized, prioritized by what needed doing first, what could wait, what required outside help. You made this list in your head, he said. I've been making it for 3 weeks. She set the paper down. Every day in Missoula, every night I couldn't sleep. I made lists. That's how you got through it. She looked at him. One of the ways. He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that neither of them named. Then she looked back at the list. I need to find my cattle, she said. That's today's first job. The cattle had not drifted far. Elias found 3 of them in the creek bottom south of the property by early afternoon, and a 4th had wandered onto the neighboring emery spread, and old Gerald Emery came out to meet them on his porch when he saw Elias and Clara riding up. And he had the look of a man who had been thinking about what to say for some time. He was 70, Gerald Emery. He had been in this valley longer than almost anyone. He had known William Whitmore since before Clara was born. Your animal's in my east pasture, he said to Clara. He said it to her directly, which she noticed, because there had been a period of 2 years when men in this valley spoke to her through a practiced vagueness that meant they were not quite committing to acknowledging her. I figured you'd be coming for her. Thank you for keeping her, Clara said. He nodded. He worked his jaw for a moment. I heard what happened. With Nathaniel. With the marshal, sir. I want you to know. He stopped. Tried again. He was not a man comfortable with this kind of conversation, she could see. He was a man of work and silence, like her father had been. I should have said something sooner. About the things Nathaniel was saying. I knew your father. I knew those stories weren't true. He looked at her straight. I told myself it wasn't my business. That's a coward's logic, and I know it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He was old, and he was ashamed, and he was telling the truth, which was more than most people had managed. My father respected you, she said finally. I'll hold on to that. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't condemnation. It was the truth. Gerald Emery received it with a short nod and went to fetch her cattle, and when he brought the animal back he also sent his teenage grandson along with instructions to help with fence repairs, which was its own kind of apology and possibly more useful. Riding back with the recovered cattle, Elias said, "You're very careful with what you give people." I had to learn to be, it shows. She glanced at him. Is that a criticism? No, he said, it's an observation. People who've been careful for a long time sometimes stay careful past when they need to. He looked ahead at the trail. That's all. She turned that over for a while without answering. The first week back was hard in the specific way that necessary work was hard. It used her completely, every hour from early light until her body refused to continue. And that fullness was actually a mercy, because it left no room for anything she wasn't ready to think about yet. Gerald Emery's grandson, whose name was Thomas, and who was 15 and quiet and surprisingly competent, came every morning for the fence work. She paid him in meals, which she had the capacity to make again now that the kitchen was hers, and he ate with the focused dedication of a growing boy, and said little, and did good work. By the end of the first week the fence was repaired, the cattle were accounted for, the house was clean, and the kitchen garden, the main one, was lost. But the small herb garden along the south wall had survived on rain, and stubbornness was producing enough for basic use. Elias had not left. He had not announced that he was staying either. It had happened the way practical things happened between practical people. There was work to do and he was there, and he helped. And when evening came, he didn't ride north toward the cabin, and she didn't suggest he should. And they had arrived at an arrangement that neither of them had explicitly negotiated. He slept in the barn on a bedroll he'd brought from his own place. He had gone back to his mountain cabin twice in the first week to get supplies and check on things, and both times he had come back, and neither of them had made any comment on the fact of his returning. He was company, Clara told herself. He was useful. He knew how to fix a fence post, and he knew the valley's cattle patterns, and he could read weather better than anyone she had met. These were practical reasons. She allowed herself these practical reasons without examining them too closely. On the 8th day, something happened that she had not anticipated, and probably should have. She came out of the house in the early morning to find 3 women from town at her gate. Not Nathaniel's allies, not people who had been actively unkind. These were women she had known her whole life in the way you knew people in a small community, by name, by circumstance, by the accumulated small interactions of years. Mabel Pruitt, whose husband ran the general store. Annette Walsh, the schoolteacher. And Ruth Carver, who was 72 and had been in the valley since the territory was still mostly theoretical, and whose opinion on most subjects was considered, by most of the community, to be something close to law. Clara stopped on the porch. Ruth Carver spoke first. "We've brought food," she said, "practical things. Flour, salt pork, some preserves from my cellar." She held Clara's gaze steadily. "And we'd like to talk if you're willing." Clara looked at the 3 women. At the basket Mabel was carrying. At Annette's hands folded together in the particular way of someone who has prepared what they want to say and is hoping they'll have the chance to say it. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Elias found reasons to be in the barn for the duration of the visit, which Clara noticed and appreciated. He had an instinct for when to be absent. Ruth Carver, seated at the kitchen table with coffee Clara had made, spoke with the directness of a woman who had lived long enough to dispense with preamble. "I want to tell you what I saw," Ruth said, "and what I did about it." Or didn't do. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "When Nathaniel started his stories about you, about your capacity to manage, about your father's supposed debts, I had doubts. I knew William. The debt story never sat right with me." A pause. "But Nathaniel is a persuasive man when he wants to be. And I told myself that legal matters were not my area and I would stay out of it." She looked at Clara. "That was wrong. I had standing in this community that you didn't have at that moment. I could have spoken and I didn't." "Why are you telling me now?" Clara asked. "Not unkindly, just directly, because you deserve to hear it," Ruth said. "And because I'm old enough to know that silence is a choice and choices have consequences, and I've spent enough years watching people leave their consequences unacknowledged." Annette Walsh said quietly, "I told my students that people should be judged by their character. I said it and I let what happened to you happen, and I didn't apply my own principle." She looked at the table. "Children notice that, when what you say and what you do don't match." Mabel Pruitt said nothing for a while. Then she said, "My husband knew the lock sale was strange. A padlock purchased for a specific external location, paid for by a man known to work for Nathaniel. He didn't say anything to anyone." She paused. "I didn't push him to." The kitchen was quiet. Clara looked at these 3 women, Ruth's directness, Annette's careful shame, Mabel's muted distress, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was the specific ache of understanding. She understood all of it. She understood how Nathaniel's power worked, how it got into the air of a community and made opposition feel impossible, how the architecture of his influence made every individual feel like they were the exception rather than the pattern. She had spent 2 years feeling alone in this town, and she understood now that it was not because people were uniquely cruel. It was because they had been afraid, and fear and cruelty produced the same result, and the person on the receiving end didn't always have the luxury of distinguishing between them. It did not erase what had happened, but it made it make a different kind of sense. "I'm not in a position to tell you it's fine," Clara said. Because it wasn't fine. What happened to me wasn't fine, and it happened in part because people who knew better said nothing. She paused. But I don't want to carry this community as an enemy. I was born here. My father is buried on this land. This is my place. She looked at each of them in turn. What I need is for it to be different going forward. Not apologies, just different. Ruth nodded. That's reasonable, she said. And practical. I'm generally both, Clara said. Something shifted in the room. Not all the way to warmth, not yet. But toward it. The way things moved toward warmth when they had been cold a long time, slowly by degrees, with the occasional step back. Mabel said, "Is there something we can help with?" Practically. Today. Clara looked at her list, still sitting on the kitchen table where she'd left it. "Yes," she said, "there is." That evening, after the women had gone, and a fair amount of the list had been redistributed into multiple sets of capable hands, Clara sat on the front step in the cooling evening air and thought about what had shifted. Elias came out of the barn and sat down on the step beside her. Not close, enough space between them that it was comfortable. He had learned the precise geography of comfortable distance very quickly, she had noticed. Like he understood instinctively that some people needed space, and that space was not the same as absence. 3 visitors, he said, you saw. Hard to miss from the barn. She told him what had been said. Not everything, but the shape of it. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without fidgeting, his eyes on the middle distance. When she finished, he said, "How do you feel about it?" Complicated. She leaned her arms on her knees, like I solved an equation that came out to a number I wasn't expecting. Good number or bad number? Neither. Just she searched for it. Just real, just the actual number. He was quiet for a moment. You gave them something they didn't deserve, Ruth Carver. The graciousness. You could have sent them home. I could, agreed. But I live here, and they live here. And this land is what I fought for, what my father built, and I didn't fight for it so I could stand on it alone. She looked at the evening sky. My father always said that the only crop worth planting was the one that fed more than just yourself. Elias was still. He said that, he said, carefully, like he was making sure he had heard it right. Every spring, she said, when we put the seeds in. He turned and looked at her, not quickly. Slowly, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. Margaret said something like that, he said, not those exact words. But the same idea. He paused. She said a house was just wood until someone used it to do something for someone else. Clara held the words gently. She understood that he hadn't talked about Margaret in a long time. She understood that this was not a small thing, his saying it. She didn't make anything of it except to receive it carefully. She sounds like she was right, Clara said. She usually was, he said. It was occasionally irritating. Clara made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, brief and surprised and real, and she felt it move through her chest and felt the surprise of it. She hadn't laughed like that in longer than she could precisely remember. Elias looked at her when she laughed, just for a moment. And whatever moved across his face in that moment was something she filed away without examining directly. 2 weeks became 3, 3 became a month. The land began to look like itself again, which was the thing Clara had wanted most, and had been almost afraid to want, because wanting things had been dangerous for a long time. But the wanting came anyway. The way things that were true to your nature came regardless of what you'd learned to do with them, and she let it. Thomas Emery still came in the mornings. Mabel Pruitt came twice a week on her way to the store, and they had fallen into a habit of brief conversation that was cautious at first and then less so. Annette Walsh stopped in on a Thursday and mentioned that the school board was looking for someone to teach a basic reading class for adults 2 evenings a week, and asked if Clara knew anyone suitable. Me? Clara said. You're the most qualified person I know who isn't already occupied, Annette said. Clara thought about it for 2 days. Then she said yes. She taught the first class on a Tuesday evening in October to 7 adults ranging in age from 19 to 64, who had various reasons for not having learned what she was going to teach them, and she stood in front of them and felt the specific combination of terror and purpose that she recognized as something worth doing. When she came home that first evening, Elias had dinner waiting. She stopped inside the door and looked at the table set, and the stove lit, and the food that had clearly been made with care from the kitchen stores. And something moved in her chest that was large and warm and required her to take a steadying breath before she trusted her voice. "You cooked," she said. "I cooked," he agreed from the stove. "It's possible I'm better at it than I let on. You let on nothing about it." "Strategic reserve," he said. He turned and looked at her. "How'd it go?" She sat down. One of them was reading his own name by the end. He'd never done it before. He looked at the paper, and he looked up at me, and she stopped. Shook her head. It was something. Elias sat down across from her and said nothing, just watched her face, and she felt herself fully seen in a way that was not, she realized, turning it over carefully frightening anymore. It had been frightening at first, being seen by him. He looked at things honestly and without the social softening that most people used to make attention bearable, and early on she had braced for what that kind of looking would eventually find and decide. She had expected him to arrive at the same conclusion: everyone else had too much of this, not enough of that, the accounting that always came out wrong. He hadn't, he just kept looking, and what she saw reflected back was not an assessment. It was she searched for the word recognition, the specific look of someone who was seeing a person they understood. "You're staring," Elias said, without particular concern. "Sorry," she said, and then, because she was done with small deceptions, "I was thinking about something." "About what?" "About the fact that you're still here," she said. She looked at him directly. "You have a cabin, a life. You've been here almost a month. You haven't talked about going back." He was still for a moment. "I go back when I need to," he said. "Check on things. But he paused, chose the next words with care. "I don't find reasons to stay away from here." "Why?" Another pause, longer. "Because here is where the work is," he said. "And you're here," he held her gaze. "Both things are true." The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the October wind came off the mountain and pressed against the house, and the house held. Clara looked at Elias Crow across her father's table and thought about the night he had opened a door she had stopped believing would open. She thought about a canteen pressed into her hands and the words "nobody deserves to die behind a locked door," and how those words had been the first honest, direct kindness she had received in longer than she should have been able to bear. She thought about the woman she had been behind that door. Fists raw and voice gone, and still hitting the wood because the alternative was worse. She thought about who had found her, and what he had chosen after finding her, and how none of it had been what she expected, and all of it had been what she needed. "I'm glad you came back," she said, "both times, all the times." He nodded once. "Carefully, so am I." They ate dinner. Outside, the wind moved through the valley, through the creek grass and the repaired fence line, and the land that was hers and had always been hers, and the kitchen was warm, and the food was good. And neither of them said anything more about any of it that night. But some things didn't need to be said to be true. On a Saturday in late October, something happened that Clara had not prepared herself for. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard a horse on the road, and she looked up to see Roy Castle riding in at his usual unhurried pace, his leather satchel across one shoulder, his expression suggesting that he was here on business and intended to conduct it efficiently. She met him at the gate. "There's a development," he said, without greeting, which was his standard approach to conversation. "Good or bad?" "Interesting," he said, "which is sometimes better than either." He dismounted. "Is Crow here?" "In the barn. Get him. This concerns you both." She got Elias, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Roy opened his satchel and pulled out a letter with the territorial office's seal on it. "The railroad," Roy said. "Nathaniel's deal with them." The federal investigation turned up the full correspondence. The railroad agent involved acted independently of his superiors and in violation of the railroad's own land acquisition guidelines. The railroad's legal counsel has been in contact with the marshal's office. He paused. They want to make restitution. Clara stared at him. To me, to the affected landowners in the valley. You're not the only one, as we suspected. Gerald Emery's East parcel, the one he sold 3 years ago, under what he describes as considerable pressure, is part of it. 2 other families as well. Roy set the letter on the table. The railroad is prepared to offer fair market compensation to the affected parties and to void the option agreements Nathaniel had structured. They want the legal exposure off their books, and they're willing to pay to make that happen. What does that mean for me specifically? It means your land is secure and recognized. It means your neighbors may have legal recourse they didn't know they had. And it means, Roy looked at her steadily, that Nathaniel Voss's operation was larger than even you knew, and the unraveling of it is going to leave this valley looking considerably different. The kitchen was quiet. Clara thought about Gerald Emery and his East parcel. The old man who had come out on his porch and said, "I should have said something sooner." She thought about the 2 families she didn't know as well, and what it might mean for them to have something returned that they had believed was simply gone. When do they need an answer? She asked. The marshal's office is coordinating a meeting with all affected parties in 3 weeks. In Missoula. Roy looked at her. You'll need to be there. I'll be there, she said. Roy nodded. He picked up his coffee and drank it and looked between the 2 of them, with the particular assessment of a man who noticed things as a professional habit. Not unkindly. Just as an observation. I'm working on it, she said. It shows. He looked briefly at Elias, said nothing. Elias said nothing back, which between the 2 of them apparently constituted a full exchange. Roy left before noon, riding back toward his ridge with the efficiency of a man who had delivered his information and was done with the proceedings. Clara stood at the gate and watched him go, and then stood there for a moment longer, looking at the valley. The light was the particular gold of late October, lower and longer, and with a quality of clarity that the summer months didn't have, like the air itself was sharper. The creek caught it and threw it back in pieces. The fence line held. The cattle were in the south pasture. Elias came and stood beside her. The valley's going to be different, she said. Yes. People who lost things might get some of it back. Maybe. That matters, she said. More than just me. More than just my land. She paused. That's what my father would have thought about first. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you think about first?" She looked at the land, at the creek, at the fence, at the small herb garden along the south wall that had survived on stubbornness and rain. Same thing, she said. I'm my father's daughter. She felt Elias look at her then, that specific quality of attention she had learned to recognize, full and direct and without the layer of judgment that most people put between themselves and what they saw. Yes, he said. You are. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her and not away, and neither of them looked away for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then she turned back toward the house. Come on, she said. There's work. He followed her in, the way he had been following her in for a month, steady and quiet and without drama, the way a man did when he was exactly where he intended to be. The door closed behind them. The valley held the light and kept it. The meeting in Missoula was set for the 3rd week of November, and in the 2 weeks before it, the valley did what small communities did when the structure they had organized themselves around suddenly collapsed. It got loud, then confused, then quiet in the specific way of people trying to figure out what they actually believed now that they couldn't rely on what they had been told to believe. Nathaniel Voss had been transferred to federal holding in Missoula 2 days after Hendricks made his formal arrests. His house sat empty. His men had dispersed the way hired men dispersed when the hiring stopped quickly, without ceremony, leaving no forwarding address. The properties he had accumulated over 4 years of systematic pressure were now in legal limbo pending the federal investigation. and the families who had sold under duress were in various states of hope and disbelief about what Roy's letter had described. Clara heard all of this in pieces from Thomas Emery, who relayed what his grandfather said at dinner, from Annette Walsh, who taught children whose parents talked at breakfast, from Mabel Pruitt, whose husband's store was where the valley came to both buy supplies and deposit information. It arrived at Clara's kitchen table, filtered and partial and sometimes contradictory, and she sorted through it the way she sorted through everything now carefully, taking what was real and setting aside what was noise. What was real? 3 families had documentation showing sales made under explicit financial pressure Nathaniel had manufactured. What was real? The railroad's legal counsel had moved fast, the way large institutions moved when they were trying to contain damage. What was real? Gerald Emery had not slept well in 3 years and had begun, tentatively, to speak with a lawyer in Missoula about his east parcel. What was noise? Most of the speculation about what would happen next. Clara focused on what she could actually affect and let the rest move past her, which was a discipline she had been building for years and was only now beginning to feel like a genuine skill rather than a forced performance. On the Tuesday before they were set to ride to Missoula, something arrived that she had not been expecting. A letter, delivered by the postal rider who came through the valley twice a week. The return address was a law office in Helena. She read it at the kitchen table while Elias was outside and Thomas Emery was repairing the last section of the north fence. She read it twice, then she set it down and sat very still for a moment. Elias came in. He read her face the way he read weather, quickly, accurately, without making a performance of it. "What happened?" he said. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it. She watched his face. He got to the second paragraph, and something in his expression sharpened. "Your father had a second account," he said. "A savings account in Helena," she said. "In a bank I didn't know existed. He opened it in 1878. He never told me." She paused. "The letter says the bank has been trying to locate me since his death. They tried the county clerk's office, but Nathaniel's interference with the local records." She stopped. "They couldn't find me through official channels. They finally located me through the federal marshal's office filing." "How much?" Elias, she told him. He looked at the number. He set the letter down. "Your father," he said. "He saved that for you." "He never spent it," she said. 12 years of putting money away and never spending it and never telling me because." Her voice caught briefly. She steadied it. "Because he wanted me to have it for something real. Not emergency, not survival, something I chose." She looked at the letter. "He wrote a letter to the bank. The bank included it with their correspondence. He said the money was for his daughter's future, whatever she decided that meant, and it was not to be touched for anything less." The kitchen was very quiet. Elias sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to fill the space, which was correct, because the space was her father, and the space needed to be exactly what it was. She let herself feel it, the full weight of it. The man who had spent 20 years teaching her to love a piece of land and another 12 years quietly building her a foundation she didn't know she was standing on. The man who had looked at her, always, like she was the answer to every question he thought mattered. She pressed her fingers against the letter. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew things were complicated for a woman alone. He knew what people were like. He'd watched it his whole life." A pause. "So he built something they couldn't take from her. He just didn't tell her it was there. Because he thought you'd use it too soon," Elias said. You knew looked up. "You'd have used it to make peace," Elias said. "To compromise. To solve the immediate problem the way you thought a reasonable person solved problems." His voice was quiet and certain. "He knew you well enough to know that, so he kept it for after." She stared at him, at the accuracy of that, at how precisely it described a conversation her father had apparently had with himself about who she was and what she needed. "He knew me better than I knew him," she said. "Parents usually do," Elias said. "And children usually find out too late." She heard something in those words that was not just about her. She held the letter, and she looked at Elias Crow, and she understood in that moment that he was not only talking about William Whitmore. She didn't press it, she just let it be what it was. "I know what I'm going to do with part of it," she said. "Already, I've been thinking about the families. The ones who sold under pressure. The railroad's offer will help some of them, but legal processes are slow and not everyone will get back what they lost." She smoothed the letter on the table. "I can help bridge that. Not everything, not for everyone. But something real." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Your father planted seeds," he said. "He always said the only crop worth planting was the one that fed more than just yourself," Elias finished. She went still. "I told you that," she said, "that he said that." "You did. You remembered it exactly." "I remember most things you say exactly," he said. And then, as if realizing that was more than he had intended to offer, he looked back at the letter. "The Missoula meeting is in 4 days. You should bring this. The lawyer in Helena will want to coordinate with the federal proceedings." She let him redirect, but she kept what he had said. She kept all of it. They rode to Missoula on a Wednesday. The two of them, and the letter, and the tin box that Clara had retrieved from the marshal's office on their last visit, and now carried in her saddlebag, like the thing it was her father's voice, made permanent on paper. The meeting was held in a proper conference room attached to the federal marshal's office, a room that fit 12 people around a rectangular table, and had the specific atmosphere of a place where things were decided. Hendricks was there. The railroad's legal 2 men from Chicago who wore good suits and had the polished efficiency of people who managed large and problems for a living were there. Roy Cassell was there, looking like a man who would rather be on his ridge but understood his presence was necessary. Gerald Emery was there, his grandson Thomas beside him. 2 other families, the Harpers, whose dairy farm parcel had been absorbed 2 years ago, and a widow named Ida Forsyth, who had sold her 40 acres 18 months back and had spent the intervening time living with her sister and not sleeping well. Clara looked at Ida Forsyth across the table, a woman in her 60s, thin in the way of someone who had lost weight they weren't trying to lose, with hands that still moved like they expected to be working land they no longer had. She held that. Hendricks opened the meeting. He was precise and thorough, laying out the legal landscape with the efficiency of someone who had briefed rooms like this before. The Railroad Council presented their offer, fair market compensation for all affected parcels, calculated at current rates rather than what had been paid, plus a separate sum for damages arising from the fraudulent coercion. Nathaniel's conviction already in process, with McCreary and Dubbins both providing full testimony, would formally void all the contracts, which meant the land itself remained a separate legal question, with some parcels recoverable and others more complicated, depending on what subsequent transactions had occurred. Gerald Emery's east parcel was recoverable. He would get it back, with compensation for 3 years of lost use. The old man absorbed this information with a stillness that Clara recognized as a man keeping something very large under very careful control. Ida Forsyth's 40 acres had been sold by Nathaniel to a speculative buyer from out of state, which made physical recovery complicated. The railroad's compensation would allow her to purchase equivalent land in the valley, if she chose. The legal counsel said this with the measured tone of professionals who were making this right as cleanly as they could manage. Ida Forsyth nodded once. She looked at the table. Clara watched her and understood exactly what that nod cost and contained. When Hendricks opened the floor for questions, Clara spoke. She had thought about what to say. She had not written it down because she didn't trust written remarks. They had a way of sounding like speeches, and she had spent too long being dismissed to use any form that invited more dismissal. She spoke plainly. She told them about her father's account. The lawyer from Helena was present and confirmed the legal standing. She proposed a Valley Assistance Fund, not a charity. She was specific about that, because charity came with a particular weight of obligation that she understood firsthand, but a practical resource. Interest-free loans for rebuilding, seed stock, equipment. Things you needed to start again that were simply out of reach when you were starting from nothing. The Railroad Council looked at each other. One of them said, Miss Whitmore. That's... I'm not asking for your opinion of it, she said pleasantly. I'm informing you that it exists. If you'd like to make a matching contribution to increase its capacity, I would accept that. She held his gaze. That would also look considerably better in the territorial newspapers than the current story does. A pause. The council looked at each other again. We'll discuss it, the second one said. Roy Cassell, at the far end of the table, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh and converted it into a cough with imperfect success. Elias, seated beside Clara, said nothing, but she felt the quality of his silence, and it was warm. The meeting lasted 3 hours and ended with signed agreements and handshakes, and the specific exhausted relief of people who have been carrying weight for a long time and have just been allowed to set some of it down. Gerald Emery shook Clara's hand with both of his and didn't say anything, which from Gerald Emery was the same as a speech. The Harper family, a husband and wife in their 40s with the weathered permanence of serious farmers, asked if they could call on her when they were ready to begin rebuilding, and she said yes. Ida Forsyth stopped her at the door. I heard what you said, Ida said. About the fund. About it not being charity. It isn't, Clara said. I know the difference. Ida looked at her. She was a woman who had been worn down to something essential, the way wood was worn to its grain. Your father was a good man. I knew him slightly. She paused. He used to say that a valley was only as strong as its weakest fence line. That one gap let everything through. Clara stood very still. She had never heard her father say those words, but she recognized them. She recognized them the way you recognized something that was true about a person, even when you'd never heard them say it specifically. That sounds right, she said. Ida nodded then, carefully, thank you. For what you did, not just the fund, all of it. She looked at Clara with the directness of someone who was going to say the true thing and was going to say it once. What happened to you was wrong. And the fact that you came back and fought for this valley, instead of against it, that's not something everyone would do. Clara held that. It's my home, she said finally. It was always going to be my home. Ida Forsyth went out the door, and Clara stood in the frame and felt the November cold and thought about fences and gaps and valleys and what it meant to repair things, and she felt the truth of it settle into her bones where it would stay. They rode home that evening. It was late when they arrived, the cold coming down hard off the mountains, and Clara's legs ached from the long day in the saddle, but she didn't mind it. Physical tiredness was honest. It meant something had been done. She put Ranger, she had started calling Elias's horse by name naturally, without deciding to in the barn with the other animals, and gave him extra feed because he'd earned it. Elias started the stove, and by the time she came inside the kitchen was warming up, and there was coffee on. She sat down. He sat down. Neither of them spoke for a while, which was something they had become very good at, the particular silence of two people who didn't need to fill space with word because the space itself was comfortable. Then Clara said, the Railroad Council is going to match the fund. I know, Elias said. You in the room? I knew when you said it. The way you said it. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. You gave them away to make it look like generosity instead of damage control. They were going to take it. Was that manipulative? She asked. Not with guilt, genuinely curious about how he read it. He thought about it honestly. It was strategic, he said. There's a difference. You wanted a real outcome. You used what you had. The outcome is real. A pause, your father would call that good farming. She smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression she had spent years managing. A real one. It moved across her whole face and she let it. Elias looked at her when she smiled, and he didn't look away this time. He held it, and what she saw in his face in that moment was not complicated. It was simple and real, and exactly what it looked like. She had been waiting, she realized, for this moment to feel frightening. It did not feel frightening. Elias, she said. Clara, he said. He said her name like it was a full sentence. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer is hard. All right, your cabin, she said, your mountain. The life you built up there, you built it because you needed it. Because the world had taken something from you, and you needed somewhere the world couldn't reach. She held his gaze. I don't want to be the thing that takes that from you. I don't want you to be here because leaving would be unkind, and you're not an unkind man. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You want to know if I'm staying because I want to or because I don't know how to leave? Yes, those aren't the same thing. No, they aren't. He set his coffee cup down. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and his eyes were steady and clear and completely unguarded, in a way she had not seen before, not in all the weeks she had known him, not even in the most difficult moments. This was different. This was a man who had decided to be seen. When Margaret died, he said, I stopped believing I was owed anything. Not happiness, not company, not a reason. I went up that mountain, and I built that cabin, and I told myself that wasn't enough. That surviving was the same as living. He paused. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it until you. She didn't say anything. I'm not here because I don't know how to leave, he said. I'm here because this is where I want to be, because you are here. Because what you are. He stopped, tried again, because who you are is something I didn't expect to find, and I would have to be a fool to walk away from it. The stove ticked. The wind pressed at the window and the house held against it, the way it always held, and Clara Whitmore looked at Elias Crow across her father's table, in her father's house on her father's land, and felt something move through her that was complete. Not perfect, not without its history of pain and hard-won survival. But complete. I'm glad you opened that door, she said. So am I, he said, every day more than the day before. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. And they stayed like that, in the warm kitchen, in the house that held, while November settled over the valley outside, and neither of them needed to say anything more. November became December. December brought snow to the upper ridges and the particular stillness of a valley going into, the kind of stillness that was not empty, but dense, full of everything waiting to begin again. Clara taught her reading class every Tuesday and Thursday. By December, she had 11 students. One of them, a woman named Pearl who was 58 years old and had spent her entire life pretending she could read well enough, wept quietly when she got through her first full paragraph without stopping. And Clara sat beside her and waited until it passed and then said simply, Do it again, and Pearl had laughed and done it again. The Valley Assistance Fund processed its first 3 applications in December. Gerald Emery took a small loan for seed stock, which Clara suspected he didn't strictly need but accepted because he understood the gesture and was returning it. The Harpers took equipment money, a young couple she hadn't known before newcomers to the valley. People who had arrived after Nathaniel's operation was already underway, and had been quietly struggling in its aftermath, took enough to carry them through the winter and into spring planting. Roy Cassell came down from his ridge once in December, ate dinner, examined the fund's paperwork with the critical eye of a man who had certified territorial documents, declared it properly organized, and went home. This was from Roy essentially a standing ovation. Thomas Emery, who had repaired more fence line than anyone and eaten more of Clara's cooking than was strictly proportional, asked one afternoon in December whether she thought he might be suited for surveying work. She told him to ask Roy Cassell. He did. Roy, after a week of what he described as consideration and what Thomas described as silence, said yes. Elias moved his essential belongings from the mountain cabin to the barn. He did it over 2 trips, without announcement, and when Clara saw the second load arrive, she said nothing about it directly, only suggested he might want the room off the kitchen rather than the barn since it had a proper stove connection. He said the barn was fine. She said the room had better light. He moved into the room, the mountain cabin he kept. He went up once a month. Clara understood this. Without asking, some places belonged to grief, not in a destructive way, but in the way of a marker, a place that said something real happened here and is not forgotten. She did not ask him to give it up. She would never ask him to give it up. What she had instead was this: his boots beside the door every morning, his voice in the kitchen, His particular quality of presence, steady, honest, without performance, woven into the days of the farmhouse until she could not remember the house without it and did not want to. The twist came in January. It came in the form of another letter, this one from the federal marshal's office, and this one addressed to both of them. Nathaniel Voss had, from his holding in Missoula, made a final attempt at leverage. He had filed a counterclaim alleging that the retrieval of the tin box from the farmhouse constituted illegal entry and theft, and that therefore the documents obtained were inadmissible and his own claim on the property should be reinstated. Clara read the letter standing at the kitchen table and felt the cold of it go through her. Elias read it beside her. He said he waited until after the railroad settlement, until after the fund was established, until after the affected families had signed their agreements. He set the letter down. He waited until there was the most to lose. "Can he do this?" she said. Her voice was controlled, barely. "He can file it," Elias said. "Whether it goes anywhere is different." She looked at the letter. She thought about everything that had been built in the last 3 months. Not just her land, the families, Gerald Emery's East Parcel, Ida Forsyth's fresh start, Thomas Emery with his sights on a surveying career, Pearl reading her second full paragraph and laughing. She thought about all of it on the other side of this letter, and she felt something rise in her that was not fear. It was the opposite of fear. It was the specific heat of a person who has lost everything once, rebuilt it, and is absolutely not going to lose it again. "Get Roy," she said. "Get Roy," she said. "And I'm going to write to the lawyer in Helena today." Roy arrived the following afternoon. He read the filing. He read it twice, slowly, with the expression of a man working through arithmetic he already knew the answer to. The entry was effected before any legal claim was filed, Roy said. Voss's forgery had not yet been formally submitted to any court. At the time of entry, the property was legally Miss Whitmore's under the original deed. Entry by the property owner to retrieve her own documents from her own property is not illegal entry. He set the paper down. This filing is meritless. His counsel knows it's meritless. This is a delay tactic and an intimidation attempt. Will Hendricks see it that way? Elias said. I'll write to Hendricks today, Roy said. My analysis will be in Missoula by Thursday. He looked at Clara. This does not undo anything. This is a man in a cell who has lost everything and is throwing the last thing he has left. Which is noise, Clara said. Which is noise, Roy confirmed. She breathed. Then she said, he's counting on me being afraid. Yes, he's been counting on that since the beginning. She looked at the letter. He put me in that box because he thought fear was the thing that moved me. She picked the letter up and held it. He never once understood that what moved me was the opposite. She walked to the stove. She opened the door. She held the letter for one moment because she was not a person who performed moments for effect, but because this one was real, and then she put it in the fire. Roy watched. I'll need to keep my copy for the response filing, he said. I know, she said. That was mine. Hendricks dismissed the counterclaim in February. His written response described it as procedurally deficient and legally baseless, and the language he used, while official, carried the specific tone of a man who had run out of patience for a particular kind of wasted time. Nathaniel's formal conviction was entered the same week, 2 counts of fraudulent land misrepresentation, 1 count of unlawful confinement, conspiracy with additional parties. The sentence was substantial. Clara received Hendricks's dismissal letter on a Thursday morning and read it at the kitchen table while Elias made breakfast, and when she put it down, he looked at her face and said, Done? Done, she said. He put a plate in front of her. She picked up her fork. That was all. That was enough. Some things didn't need ceremony because they were already complete. Spring came to the Bitterroot Valley the way it always came, not all at once, but in negotiations, warmth arguing with cold until warmth finally won. The creek ran high from snowmelt, and the soil in Clara's garden was richer than it had been the previous year, the way fine soil got when it had rested. She planted early. Elias helped. They worked side by side in the kitchen garden and then in the main field, and there was a morning in April when the light came through clean, and the soil was warm enough to feel it through her knees as she knelt to set seeds. And Elias was 3 rows over, and they were talking about something completely ordinary, which seed stock performed better in the valley's specific drainage, and it struck her, without warning, how simply and completely different her life was from what it had been 1 year ago. 1 year ago, she had been running out of options, running out of the specific energy that kept a person fighting when the fight kept going longer than any person should have to fight alone. 1 year ago, Nathaniel Voss had seemed immovable and the town had seemed decided, and the locked door had been 3 weeks away. She set another seed. Elias said something about drainage, and she answered, and he said something back, and she said something back. And it was the conversation of two people who knew each other's thoughts well enough to think in front of each other. And the sun was on her back, and the soil was in her hands, and the land was hers, and she was unambiguously home. That evening, they sat on the front step, the way they had fallen into the habit of sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Not so close it was dramatic. Just the comfortable proximity of people who had stopped managing distance between them. Elias said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "The mountain cabin," he said. "I want to take you up there. When the upper trails are clear. He paused. "I want you to see where I was before." She understood what he was offering. Not the cabin itself, the history, the 8 years. Margaret and the grief and the choice he had made to disappear from a world that had hurt him too much. He was offering to show her who he had been before she knew him, which was the kind of offering that only came from one kind of place. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded. May, she agreed. They sat in the spring evening, and the valley was below them, and above them, and all around them, and Elias Crow put his arm around Clara Whitmore's shoulders quietly, without announcement, and she leaned into it. And the mountains held their silence, the way mountain held everything, without comment, without judgment, permanent and complete. She thought about fists on a locked door. She thought about a canteen pressed into bleeding hands. She thought about 3 days in the dark and a man who had chosen not to walk past a sound that could have been the wind. She thought about her father counting seeds in the dark of February, knowing what he was planting would not bloom until a season he could not fully foresee. She thought about Roy Cassell and his ridge and his credentials and his one almost smile. She thought about Pearl reading a paragraph and laughing. She thought about Ida Forsyth's hands that still moved like they remembered land. She thought about a valley that was learning, slowly and imperfectly, and with the full weight of what learning cost, to be something better than it had been. And she thought about this, a woman who had been told, in 100 different ways across a lifetime, that she was too much and not enough, and that the world had already made its decision about her, and how that woman had found, in the end, that the world's decision meant nothing at all. That the only decision that had ever mattered was the one she made when she put her fists against that door and refused to stop. She was still here, the land was hers. The man beside her had chosen her, the way people only chose things they were certain about quietly, practically, completely, without condition or performance, or the need for anyone else's permission. And the valley that had once looked at Clara Whitmore and seen a problem now looked at her and saw exactly what she was and what she had always been, what her father had known before she was old enough to know it herself. A woman of this land, a woman of this valley, a woman who had fought for every person in that valley, even when not one of them had fought for her, because that was the only kind of person she knew how to be. The spring evening settled over the Bitterroot Mountains, and the creek ran clean, and the fence lines held, and in the house behind them the stove was warm, and the kitchen smelled like the bread she had put in before they came out seaside. And Clara Whitmore had everything she had ever needed, not because the world had finally given it to her, but because she had refused, every single day, to let the world take it away. This was her story, and it ended exactly where it was always meant to end, not with rescue, not with permission, not with the world finally changing its mind. It ended with a woman standing on her own ground, unafraid, fully herself, and completely, irreversibly home.